All right, this is it. Welcome back, guys. Now I'm filming this in December, and I'm freezing in the classroom. There's no students in here, okay? But this is the beginning of 1302, okay? And in 1302, we're going to be picking up right where we left off in 1301. We ended with Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, and we talked about the end of the Civil War. Now, we had briefly introduced the topic of Reconstruction. That's going to be the main focus for our first topic. But this first unit is going to take us from Reconstruction through America's Gilded Age in the late 1800s, the period of industrialization, vast new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and of course, westward expansion, the Indian Wars. So we'll be talking all about that in this first unit, and we will get up through the beginnings of the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, the 20th century. This picture right here is of obviously the hand and the torch of the Statue of Liberty. It was originally, it's cast in bronze, and she was bronze for a while before oxidation. It led to that copper coating becoming green as we know her today. But in 1876, the people of France actually donated the Statue of Liberty to the United States as a sign of respect and friendship between our two great countries. Remember, that goes back to the Revolutionary War. This was the centennial celebration, because remember, America was basically born or founded in 1776 when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and America separated itself from Britain. In 1778, that was when France joined the United States with that Treaty of Alliance after the Battle of Saratoga. And we would not have been able to break away and gain our freedom if it were not for the French. And she came over the Statue of Liberty in different pieces, and they assembled her. That was from the French. That is very strange how it is doing that with the bullets. Oh, well, live and learn. So Reconstruction is the period after the Civil War. But the thing is, it actually begins while the Civil War is still happening. You go through about 3 different phases of Reconstruction that you guys are going to need to be aware of. So we're going to be talking in this first section during this time when we're trying to rebuild the nation after it has been torn apart, North and South. Reconstruction, the 3 different phases. The first is presidential Reconstruction, which takes place actually beginning in 1863 under Lincoln's 10% plan and carrying through under Lincoln's successor after his assassination, a guy named Andrew Johnson, who will be the first president ever to be impeached, although not removed. And then the second phase of Reconstruction after the presidential Reconstruction is called Congressional Reconstruction, or sometimes also referred to as Radical Reconstruction. And this was when you had Congress basically take the reins and say, not so fast, Mr. President, you going too easy on that South. What was all this war for? We're going to punish, we're going to make sure we liberate, we're going to make sure that we entitle to certain rights and freedoms these newly emancipated freedmen. And so that will be Radical Reconstruction led by Congress, radical Republicans in Congress. Excuse me. And then finally, the last phase of Reconstruction is kind of when it comes to an end, the fall of Reconstruction. So those will be the 3 phases we're going to look at. But as of beginning this, I just want to talk briefly about what was going on during the war and what plans were being made and kind of the situation for African Americans. There's about 4.5 million African Americans in the United States. Remember, over 4 million of them were slaves, and most of them were in the South. With the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued in the fall of 1862 after the Union quote-unquote victory at the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, and then remember, since the South did not comply, it went into effect on January 1st, 1863. That Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves that were in Confederate occupied territory or in the South. It did not free the slaves that were in the border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware. It did not do that. And so it was a military and political, piece of legislation, much less so than actual like freeing of all the slaves. What will free all the slaves will be the 13th Amendment, as we have talked about. That gets ratified in December of 1865, way after Lincoln's death. Remember, Lincoln dies on April 15th, 1865. So, for a lot of African Americans, they were still in bondage by the time the war ended. Many were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in the South or by Union soldiers, and many more that heard about the Emancipation Proclamation are going to be seeking to escape from their plantations, to overthrow their masters, to take advantage of the Civil War that was happening, and use the chaos of war to basically help their escape. And as slaves became freed during the war and immediately following it, especially after the 13th Amendment, this is a whole new door opening. These enslaved people, many of them never thought they would live to see the day when they would gain their freedom. Many of them had been enslaved, their whole lives, their parents' lives, their grandparents for generations. The first slaves that were brought over to the British American colonies were like in 1619 at Jamestown. Some of them had been slaves in America for literally generations, for as long as their family history could be remembered. And so here suddenly this is just an enormous change that is taking place in so many lives. And the possibilities were endless, but also incredibly limiting. Because remember that most of these African Americans, almost all of them, they are illiterate. They are without specific jobs. There were slaves, of course, who had skilled professions. They had to be taught on their plantation to do certain things for the farm. Maybe they knew how to repair wagons. Maybe they knew how to blacksmith, to put shoes on horses or mules. Maybe they had certain skill sets, but most slaves, they did not have anything that would bring them a living. Most of them were field workers, okay? And so opportunities are going to be very limited. But now that they have their freedom, now slaves can officially legally get married to their long loves. Now slaves can officially leave the plantation and try to find those family members that they might have been separated from for decades. They could try to go and find children that had been sold away from them. They could try to find their husbands or wives that had been sold away at auction. They could try to find their parents. One of the most important things that many slaves did immediately upon getting their freedom was that they went and tried to find their families. It makes sense. But again, what kind of life do you have now that you are free? You have the skin on your back, but you own no possessions. You own very little in the way of clothing itself, no property to speak of, no land, okay? Opportunities are extremely limited. And this was one of the things addressed in Sherman's Special Field Order 15. This is a very big deal. It took place in early 1865 as the war was coming to its conclusion. And remember Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman was like Grant's right-hand man. He was one of the generals that was out west with Grant, winning at Forts Henry and Donaldson, securing Shiloh and Vicksburg and cutting off the South at the Mississippi River. And then after Grant became the overall Union general, Sherman was put in charge of the Union Army of the West. And it's Sherman who goes after Chattanooga and Chickamauga in Tennessee. It is Sherman's forces, his Union forces, that are going to march in through to Georgia and take Atlanta, allowing Lincoln to have a very important, much needed re-election victory. Momentum for that political victory rested totally on Sherman's victory at Atlanta. And then Sherman does his famous March to the Sea, where he marches his troops and carves a swath through Georgia and called the March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. And this is the scorched earth policy. This is total war. Remember, Sherman is ruthless and he is destroying all infrastructure, everything that would help allow the South to continue fighting. Sherman destroys. His armies are tearing up railroads, and they're crisscrossing and tying them around trees after, melting them down a little bit so they could be bent. They called them Sherman bow ties. Sherman's forces are burning fields, so the South, the Confederate Army doesn't have any supplies, any food. They're destroying livestock. There weren't like a lot of civilians that were butchered by his troops. They're not animals, but I mean, there were some, they got in the way, but mainly crops and livestock. And of course, the infrastructure, the railroads and the factories of the South, any that they came across were destroyed. That's the scorched earth policy of Sherman. So that's William Tecumseh Sherman. Remember, this guy's a bad, you know what I'm saying? His middle name, in fact, comes from the Native American warrior Tecumseh during the War of 1812. So Sherman, after taking Georgia and then marching into South Carolina, where his army is going to be doing a lot of that scorched earth policy in retribution for South Carolina basically being the den of revolution, he is having hundreds of thousands of newly escaped freed slaves joining his army and, basically worshiping him and thanking him and being very grateful that his army has liberated them, has freed them. But he has hundreds of thousands of newly freed slaves following along. And Sherman's like, I got to get some military targets done. I can't be supporting all of these hundreds of thousands of extra people, these civilians, these newly freed Black men and women. And so something must be done. And in the winter of 1865, actually I think it was March 1865, Sherman is going to be joined by the Secretary of War, Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, an abolitionist. And they will meet in a beautiful parlor in downtown Atlanta with a group of Black representatives. Mostly they were newly freedmen. Most of them had been former slaves. And the one that was chosen to lead these former slave representatives, these new freedmen, was a pastor. And basically, what they decide during this meeting, it was a very important meeting where you got to kind of hear from the Black perspective, where these Georgia Black pastors and freedmen, they tell Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General Sherman, like, hey, this is what freedom means to us. This is what we need. This is what's going on. This is what we think about the Civil War. And the main thing that they keep reiterating to Sherman and Stanton is that now that they're freed, in order for them to truly have their freedom and to be able to provide for themselves, newly freed people need land. They needed acreages so that they could farm for themselves and they could have control over their own production. That was what freedom meant to them, okay? So it's in that effort that Sherman issues this special field orders. And Special Field Order 15 was really controversial. I think the main reason Sherman did it, because Sherman was not an abolitionist. He certainly did some things that were very abolitionist, but at the beginning of the war especially, he would not be considered one. This was a military effort on his part, and it was done to prevent him from having hundreds of thousands of camp followers that he couldn't possibly take care of as he's trying to wage war in the last months of this Civil War. But what it did was it basically said of the 400,000 acres of coastal lands in Georgia and South Carolina that Sherman's army has taken control of, there were no Confederates anywhere in this 400,000 acres. The Union Army had confiscated this land, and Sherman in his special field order was going to give all of that land to these former slaves, these freedmen, so that they could each have their own little lot of land. Each freedman family would be given 40 acres. And Sherman had a whole bunch of extra army mules used to pull the wagons for the military, for the logistics, their food and everything the military needed. A lot of them were old and broken down from Sherman marching them so much. So Sherman said, I have all these extra mules, y'all can take some of those too. And this is where the very famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule, comes from. So this was Sherman basically saying every freed family, every freedman's family, they would get 40 acres to have, you know, their own land to farm on and be able to take care of themselves, to be truly free. They'd have their own land, and they'd get a mule to help them farm it. You know, mules can pull the plows and stuff. Now, what happens from this and why that phrase 40 acres and a mule becomes so important is that this, like, news of this spread faster than the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? Once word got through from the Georgia coast, it burns through all of Georgia, through all of the South, and pretty much every African-American person is gonna hear about this. And they think that it meant that this was something that the federal government was entitling to all newly freed people, that every newly freed person all across the South, all 4+ million of them, would be getting 40 acres and a mule. And so this also becomes a metaphor for the broken promises of the Civil War and Reconstruction that never come to fruition for African-American people, because obviously they're not going to be able to give every family 40 acres and a mule. And even with Sherman's special field orders, this will not be a permanent solution. Okay, the level of devastation across the South at the end of the Civil War cannot be stated enough. It was bad. The Civil War, remember, is the worst war in American history in terms of casualty numbers. 620,000, 720,000, 700,000. Any of the recent estimates on how many lives were lost all total more than all other American wars combined, okay? It was staggering how many people died. And remember, that's because they were all Americans, North and South, Union versus Confederate, blue versus gray. Everyone who died was an American. Now for the South, especially, remember, their population was much, much less than the North. The South had approximately 9 million white people versus the North's 22 million. And so for the South, the devastation was complete. Pretty much every major Southern city, from Richmond to Montgomery, was completely leveled and destroyed. You can see in this picture here, it's kind of like the ruins you would expect to see at the end of the Second World War in Europe. That's what it looked like in the United States at the end of the Civil War in the South, where most of the fighting had taken place. Basically, 1 in 5 of the adult white male population of the South was dead from the Civil War. That is a huge, huge number of people. And so obviously with Southern farmland, Southern factories, Southern cities destroyed, and already, remember, thanks to the Northern strategy from old General Winfield Scott, the Anaconda Plan, we'll go back. The Southerners during the war had begun to starve. Many Southern white women, they would write to the front to their husbands or their fiancés, and they would tell them how they were starving back on the plantations. They would tell them how there was no food able to be gotten in because of this Union blockade. And once Grant and Sherman, they took Vicksburg and they cut the South off of the Mississippi River. Remember, there's no supplies that are going to be reaching the South from Texas or, you know, from Mexico. They were getting supplies through from France. And so they were completely cut off and they were starving to death. There were hunger strikes and bread riots in the capital of the Confederacy, in Richmond, Virginia. And so the South's devastation was pretty bad. And many Southerners, they're not accepting of the loss. They're not accepting of just the devastation and death that is around them, but also just that the fact that it had all been for nothing, that they had lost the Civil War. You see this with like Lincoln's assassination by Southern supremacists like John Wilkes Booth. He was not alone in feeling that way. Okay, the South shall rise again. Remember, that was the phrase he gave right after he had shot Lincoln in the back of the head at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And this creates this lost cause idea that will be common in the South, especially in the early 1900s, and even you still see it today. It still hasn't gone away. But this lost cause idea It's basically denialism, saying that the South never really lost the Civil War. You know, they lost it because, you know, this or that, but the Southern soldiers, they never really lost, and our ideas never really lost. It's refusing to admit defeat. That's the lost cause. And basically also saying that, you know, the Southern way of life would persist. Because, I mean, that's what the Civil War had been about. Would the South be allowed to continue its slave-based economy? And since the Union won, the answer to that is no. But the lost cause denialers, they basically, you know, they would argue against that. They would fight against that and basically refuse to accept defeat. And you'll see also, I want to play for you guys also this song. It's become very famous. It's called "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down," and it's a song from the civil rights era, actually, 100 years later, in the 60s, 1960s, 1970s, and they encapsulate this lost cause theory. Remember, the lost cause is basically this idea, again, that from Southerners, from Confederates, that the Civil War had been a just and heroic war, that slavery was a good thing because it perpetuated Southern prosperity and a good Southern economy. And it downplays all the wicked, evil sides of slavery and the Southern way of life. We'll also see this lost cause in more than just songs. You'll also see it in like movies, like very famously, movie that's going to help for the second resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. It was called The Birth of a Nation. In 1915, it was screened at the White House by President Woodrow Wilson. It portrays groups like the Klan who are trying to bring back Southern society as heroic and as the heroes of this story, of this tragic thing that was lost, and it's so sad, and blah, blah, blah. That's the lost cause ideology. All right, and the last thing I want to talk to you guys about in our first lecture back, it's Reconstruction era, guys. It's not all going to be pretty, is the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a pretty thing, but it was very controversial, not just in the South, who hated the Freedmen's Bureau, but also in the North, where there were many who were ambivalent towards it. But the Freedmen's Bureau was basically created in March of 1865, signed by Lincoln. And what it did was it's going to employ about, at its height, 900 mostly Northern whites to set up schools, hospitals, employment offices, and all sorts of aid for newly freed slaves throughout the South. Because remember that once they were freed, they had nothing. Okay, once they were free, they were left off on their own, and they needed assistance. They needed clothing in like the winter. They needed to be given tools in order to find jobs, which meant learning literacy, learning how to read and write, which meant setting up schools. If they were going to find any sort of professional work, you also needed to set up colleges that would accept Blacks. You also needed to assist many African Americans in immediately finding jobs, regardless of education. Like, they needed jobs in order to make money to provide for themselves and their families. So setting up job recruitment areas and providing work. You also keep in mind that most hospitals in the United States, but especially in the South, would not admit Black people. They would not even treat African Americans. And so they needed medical care. They needed also legal assistance in settling disputes, since Blacks were not traditionally allowed to enter court or have any rights. And they also performed legal ceremonies such as marriage, so that Blacks could finally legally marry for the first time. So this is the Freedmen's Bureau, and probably one of the most important things that they did was setting up the schools. Over 1,000 schools for African American children and adults were set up, and many of the traditionally Black colleges today were also founded during this era with help from the Freedmen's Bureau. This includes Fisk University in Tennessee, Howard University in Washington, D.C., Hampton, and many, many others, these traditionally Black colleges. The Freedmen's Bureau, like I said, the Northern whites who worked for the Bureau, many of them were women, many of them were teachers. You remember from Horace Mann and the reform movements we talked about last semester. A lot of these Northerners who are being incredibly altruistic and helping, they faced enormous discrimination basically for assisting newly freedmen, not just in the South where they were despised, but also from other Northerners who did not think these resources should be spent this way. The Freedmen's Bureau is also going to have the authority to divide 40-acre plots for rental and sale to these newly freed individuals, again, enhancing this idea of 40 acres and a mule. It was started under Sherman's Special Field Order 15. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to be under enormous stress trying to provide for over 4 million individuals throughout the South in the 11 former Confederate states with only less than 1,000 workers to do so. And it will be repeatedly under attack by Democrats, including by President Johnson, who tried to veto the Freedmen's Bureau. And that will see one of our very first ever overturns of a presidential veto, when Congress actually summons up the 2/3 supermajority needed to overturn a presidential veto. All right. When we come back next time, we will talk about the first phase of Reconstruction. I'm going to review Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. Obviously, he gets cut short on his efforts, and we'll see where the next president, Andrew Johnson, is going to take it up from there. All right. Remember, before I leave you guys, a couple important things about Reconstruction. It's this time period after the Civil War, and it's going to be about answering a couple of key questions. So I'll leave you with these questions before I actually go. And I know you're like, oh my God, where's she end? The first question, okay, is how do you rebuild the country? Reconstruct, how do you bring back the South into the country? What will that look like? Okay, how do you allow the South to come back from what they just did? Okay, the second question is, what do you do about these newly freed individuals? Again, we're talking about over 4 million newly freed African Americans. What do you do with them? Obviously, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be a big answer, but there's a lot of other questions that we still have for how you deal with this. And then finally, the last question I'm going to leave you guys with is, who's in control of this? Will it be the president or will it be Congress? And we'll talk about that next time. Thank you guys so much, and goodbye.